Madam President, I know there's a lot of passion on the floor here regarding this particular legislation. Probably no one on this floor has not had some semblance of a disaster in their state that they represent and the people. Sandy clearly rises to one of the top categories of something truly catastrophic, but many of us have experienced tornadoes and destruction and floods and a number of other disasters. And clearly, one of the essential functions of government is to address those in immediate need and meet some of those emergency needs. And in cooperation with local and state authorities and federal authorities stepping up, we've been able to assure the American people that help is on the way. And hopefully help is on the way in an expeditious manner so that it gets to those who need that emergency help quickly. It's regrettable that it's taken this long for some of this money to be appropriated. I personally think that we could have expedited this had we gained the support for an amendment I offered in December, which would have met immediately emergency needs, but yet given the Congress time to work through the process of examining other aspects of the bill that, number one, were not related to Sandy, number two, that fell on various members' wish lists of things that they wanted done for their state. Of course, that's their responsibility to do so. But we all know that when you see a train moving out of the station that's going to be passed and going to become law, there's been a temptation through the years to add unrelated matters to that particular bill, knowing that it'll get attached to the train and ultimately voted on and supported. We saw what happened during the fiscal cliff debate we had 15 minutes or so to examine the final bill, and of course later all these egregious examples of spending that had nothing to do with the issue itself, but were tacked on at the last minute. And so really what we were trying to talk about here is a process that I believe, and I think a number of members believe, is necessary to vet every spending appropriation that comes before this body, to ensure that it meets the essential function, to ensure that it is not loaded up with extraneous matters, to ensure that we are making the most careful use of taxpayer dollars as is possible. It's not an ideology. It's those of us responding to some very basic math that shows us that we have a decreasing capacity to address these types of emergencies, to address education spending, to address medical research spending, to address transportation spending, to pave roads, to rebuild bridges, to address any number of discretionary items that we can debate the value of. That is shrinking dramatically. And so if we don't apply at least some discipline to how we evaluate and how we examine how we're going to go forward, without continuing to plunge into debt and to borrow money, which is ultimately unsustainable, then I think we're shirking our duty here. I'm not down here to talk against funding for this disaster. I'm down here to discuss how we together, Republicans and Democrats, need to apply some discipline to how we make decisions. It's been a time-honored practice here to load up necessary bills with extraneous matters. And it's been a time-honored practice not to provide the oversight necessary to go back and look at how effectively we have spent the taxpayers' dollars in the past and what kind of things we can do to ensure that we don't make those mistakes in the future. It's also, I think, worthwhile to at least examine the possibility of paying for expenditures, particularly when you're borrowing 40 cents of every dollar, when you are careening into a debt and deficit, which the younger generations are not going to be able to pay off without serious adverse consequences. You know, I think the latest figure was that for $1 spent on the younger generations, my generation gets $4 from the federal government. Well, there's a moral issue here about what kind of country we're leaving for the future and what we're turning over to our children. And so I think it's worthwhile to at least acknowledge that those of us who raise these kind of questions not be labeled or targeted as trying to throw people on the street or not respond to legitimate needs, but we're simply trying to say we need some standards here to apply to a situation where our spending is out of control. Now, every business in America has to do this and has had to do this past 4 or 5 years in order to survive. Families have had to do this in order to make sure they can make the mortgage payment, or dad has lost his job. There's been enforced discipline on the basis of economy that has been stagnant for about 4 years. In the meantime, the federal government keeps plunging into debt. So if someone brings forward an alternative to at least give us the opportunity to provide effective oversight and to make sure that this money does go to emergency needs and doesn't just fulfill a wish list for what some cities would like to do in the future to prevent against future storms, not that we shouldn't be debating that, but it doesn't qualify as an emergency need, getting to the money to the people that need it now. These are future decisions. We haven't had time to assess those. We haven't had time to examine those in detail. And we haven't used the process that is in place here in the United States Senate to go through committees and let the committees work through, is this essential to meeting the emergency needs, or can we set this aside and spend a little more time examining it, looking at it to make sure that this is how we want to go forward. We have a habit here of throwing money at things under an emergency category, and then later finding out that, one, it wasn't an emergency that where the money went, and number two, it was misspent and not effective. We just simply can't afford to keep doing this. And once again, I want to state, we're not here trying to undermine funding for Sandy that's needed for Sandy. And so some of the things that the House did, I think, are legitimate in terms of saying, let's set aside unrelated matters, and it doesn't mean we cast them into the dustbin and never to be seen again. It simply means let's let those that are not emergency situations be more carefully examined in terms of whether we need that. And if someone does come to the floor, as Senator Lee is going to do, is my understanding, and offers a potential offset, let's at least look at that possibility. The debt clock is ticking, and ticking ever faster, and it is destroying the hopes and dreams of future generations. And I think we have a moral responsibility to at least be as conscious and effective with dealing with the taxpayers' dollars in terms of how they're spent, whether it's an emergency supplemental related to a disaster or whether it's just a normal appropriation that comes along every year through our appropriations process. We haven't exercised that kind of discipline, and our country's going to pay a very serious series of consequences as a result of that. And most importantly, we're denying young people in this country a future that we have enjoyed, but we're not going to be able to pass on to others. With that, Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President,